Welcome to the Met. We're so glad you could join us for this conversation about art and activism in Manhattan's Chinatown then and now. May Lum, the Met Civic Practice Partnership Artist in Residence, and artist Tomie Arai will discuss past and present activism through the arts in Manhattan's Chinatown, exploring key themes of resistance and resilience, anti-gentrification, and the community's cohesion during the current wave of anti-Asian racism and violence. The Met's Civic Practice Partnership Residency Program, launched in 2017, welcomes artists as critical collaborators, expanding our thinking about the relationships of diverse audiences to our collections. Invited artists like the W.O.W Project push the boundaries of creative practice and research at the museum, challenging accepted narratives and centering community-driven perspectives. They connect ambitious, collaborative, social justice-oriented art projects with New York City neighborhoods and partner with us in co-imagining new ways to invest in communities and build sustainable relationships. May is the founder of the W.O.W Project, a community initiative in Manhattan's Chinatown that amplifies local voices and stories through art, culture, and activism. She's the fifth-generation owner of her family's century-old porcelain business, the oldest continuously operating store in Chinatown, W.O.W & Co., for which the W.O.W Project is named after its initials. In response to the rapid displacement of Chinese Americans from Chinatown, the W.O.W Project produces woman and non-binary-led initiatives, transforming Lum's family-owned porcelain wares storefront into an alternative space for community dialogue and grassroots action. Tomie Arai, recently commissioned to work with the W.O.W Project, is an artist and community activist who was born, raised, and is still active in New York City. Her work consists of multimedia site-specific art pieces that deal with topics of gender, community, and racial identity. She co-founded the Chinatown Art Brigade, an intergenerational collective driven by the fundamental belief that cultural, material, and aesthetic modes of production have the power to advance social change. Together, they make work that centers art and culture as a way to support community-led campaigns around issues of gentrification and displacement. I hope you enjoy this intimate conversation that was recorded at W.O.W & Co. in June 2021 on the occasion of Tomie's commission as part of the W.O.W Project's 5th anniversary. It touches on her deep history as an activist and how that has influenced younger generations through initiatives like W.O.W.
I remember Diane Wong bringing us together, Chinatown Art Brigade, yourself, Mancy Kong, and Betty Yu. And, while I was shadowing Diane on her interviews with different stakeholders in Manhattan's Chinatown, she was talking to me about all the folks that were doing similar work, that were dreaming up similar visions, and Chinatown Art Brigade definitely came up, and you were in your beginnings too of figuring out what the collective would look like, what the work would look like in relationship to CAV, organizing Asian communities. And I remember sitting in the back kitchen of W.O.W and meeting you all and talking about what inspired us, but also how we were incorporating resistance to gentrification and building strength and resilience in the work too. I remember the first panel discussion that we held in the shop, which was about art gallery. That will never leave me, that feeling of very intense, very intense conversation and not really knowing what to do with that energy. I think after that conversation of talking and acknowledging that there are over 125 art galleries in the neighborhood and that they are not actually creating space for the community, I think was really hard for me to swallow, and not knowing where does W.O.W Project fit in this ecosystem of cultural spaces in the neighborhood. How do we respond to that in our work, and how do we set ourselves apart and respond to in the future programming that we were going to do after that discussion. And that feels like such a long time ago, but also really, I can palpably feel some of that energy from that conversation too. And I know you were on the panel for that as well.
That's right. I was moderating the panel, and we invited, I I think, a handful of galleries that didn't respond, but the Museum of Chinese America was represented, and it was a store filled with really very concerned and interested stakeholders in Chinatown. And I remember thinking that it was just amazing that we had access to the space, that, you know, with the deep history of WOW and just how the store, the deep and long history of Wing On Wo, and its standing, you know, as sort of a landmark business in Chinatown, to be able to actually sit in the store and have a conversation about the future of Chinatown was so amazing to me, you know, that you had thought to have this community conversation inside the store and not in another, you know, like a large institution or in some kind of government agency, but to really bring the people who would be most affected and impacted by change into the store. That was pretty remarkable, and I realized what a unique and very precious, I think, partnership that was.
Yeah, and how do you think that from that moment of Chinatown Art Brigade, bringing that into the conversation, bringing that into a community dialogue space, to acknowledge the presence of art galleries and the sometimes tension between artists and affordable commercial rent and gentrification, how has that kind of evolved or grown over time with the Chinatown Art Brigade's work, and how you all are addressing and educating and building awareness around cultural displacement in Chinatown?
Well, I think from the very moment that CAV, Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, approached us to do an art project with the tenants, we realized how important it was as artists to step back and participate in a project that was community-led and community-driven. And I think from that very first light projection that we did, the partnerships that we were trying to build with not just the tenants, but all the people who would be impacted by displacement, really grounded us. And I felt like that first program that we did with you around the galleries in Chinatown helped us be even more grounded in thinking about who we were speaking to and who we wanted to work with and imagine, you know, what the community could be like together. We were really pushing back a lot around all these ideas about artists coming into communities with, you know, ideas for social engagement. And in fact, you know, we had gotten a very first grant to do those projections from the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And you know, we started as a project that in many ways felt uncomfortably accountable to a larger agency. But I think over the last few years, we've developed a stronger sense of purpose and mission from all the partnerships that we've tried to build in Chinatown and, you know, across the city. But we really began to think of ourselves more as a collective and less project-driven, but really more perhaps mission-driven or driven by a shared set of values that I feel like, you know, we're so closely aligned to WOW as well. You know, I think that there's a deep history of activism in Chinatown, and not just New York Chinatown, but Chinatowns across the country. And in many ways, access to that history is made even more difficult because, you know, it's not a narrative that's shared widely in either, you know, through history books or through I guess, just the written narrative about the city. And you could say the same thing about the history of slavery in New York and the history of police violence in New York. I mean, there's so many stories that have been erased about the ways in which people of color and poor and working people have had to struggle to survive, and so I'm just learning about that very deep and powerful history now through some of the members of CAB who are actually related to people who have been activists in their own lives. Betty Yu's grandfather was a laundryman who formed a laundrymen's association. Her family was involved in the first in establishing one of the first unionized restaurants in New York, Silver Palace, and I feel like I'm learning about this sort of legacy of activism. There are also a number of community organizations in Chinatown that have had a long reach in terms of inspiring young activists to go out and continue to work, on behalf of the community. So I feel like CAB is really just part of this long legacy of activism, and one of the things that we're hoping to do through our work is to reach back and try to reclaim that, and in our own work continue to lift it up, and through the tenants that we work with and their stories of resistance, connect those histories.
I think for me personally, it has meant a lot to be able to see and have role models and people that are femme, queer, trans, Asian folks that are leading this work because of Chinatown's history of it being a men's club, a bachelor society, very much built on a patriarchal system. And I think being able to, at the first moments of my journey and establishing the W.O.W project and this space and meeting the Chinatown Art Brigade and being like, okay, yeah, I'm like in community, I'm in good company. That was really meaningful for me to have as a support system to kind of like move the W.O.W project along and also find purpose and feel rooted in that purpose beyond like our first conversations that we were having in 2016. So thinking about this moment with this collaboration, with the Met, with our residency, it coincided with our 5-year anniversary, and for us that's a huge milestone in celebrating this space that we've been nurturing and nourishing over the years and creating an alternative space for these folks that haven't had the opportunity to build leadership or be uplifted due to all of what I was saying before of the exclusionary policies, of just culturally how women and queer and trans people were treated or mistreated in their home countries, and then that kind of like trickling into how Chinatown was established and how the community operated. So it just meant, I think it made so much sense to bring Tomie in for this and have her bring in her individual practice, but also her work with the Chinatown Art Brigade as a collective into this commission in thinking about all these questions about celebration, joy, a parade as a protest. How do we embody that in like a material piece like this, like these vessels here, but also for us, like our question for ourselves in thinking about how to activate it, just thinking how we can embody that with like this amazing artist, activist that has had such a long history of creating public art in the neighborhood, of organizing with different community groups. And I mean, that's like, there's a long list, but I think it just made a lot of sense and was exciting to me to, bring her in for this project and see what we could do together.
I feel like this project has been, in many ways, a gift that May gave to me. And so I'm grateful on so many levels for the opportunity to not only apply myself to a medium that I really never engaged with, making an object out of porcelain and clay, but I think after a very long year of sheltering in place and struggling, I think, with all the weight of all the world events that occurred this past year, it just felt like if there was one thing I wanted to do, it was to make something and bring it into the world and really think about how to celebrate being together. I know that there's, and certainly COVID has just magnified in so many ways, just the racial and economic disparities in our lives, and how there are so many things that are broken that need to be fixed. And I've been so uplifted and inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement and the global protests for, the international and global protests for racial justice. And I just felt like it was really a life-changing and historic moment that we all collectively experienced. And there is a point at which you realize that this is a moment that we all have to really think about how we can make the world a better place, to really think forward. And so this idea of celebration, of imagining a new world, of not going back, but forward, I think that all of those different ideas were percolating, and then May gave me this opportunity to create a vessel. And certainly one of the things that I think came out of this pandemic is this acknowledgement that we really need to take care of ourselves and our communities, and this ethics of care, this community care, seems so important. So the idea of creating these vessels that would embody or hold and be objects that would receive these feelings of wanting to care and shelter and protect and create our own safety for each other. It felt like such a wonderful door had opened for me, and not having any kind of experience with ceramics, I just had to go to WOW, and look around the store to realize, what an amazing body of work, that culturally, had so much significance to not just the people who entered the store, but for Chinatown, for so many people who maybe had not thought about art and culture in terms of the actual objects, that May and her family, sell in the store, and that are really in many ways objects of art, but are actually functional and can be a part of one's life, in ways that art that hangs on walls can't. To be able to recreate that, felt to me like, just wonderful challenge. I did look at the collection at the Met. They shared some images from the Met's collection of ceramics and pottery, and I was really, have always been inspired by the Greek vases and vessels that are displayed there, and this idea of celebrating heroes and this sort of procession and display of strength, you know, that is so much a part of the motifs of these Greek vases, and so I tried to combine that with the unique designs that I saw at Wing on Woe. And I think originally we were talking about going to the fabricators that you use in China, and just the idea of making that global connection, you know, was so exciting. But in the end, you know, I think working directly with a ceramicist here in New York was actually a wonderful option. Because if anything, you know, ceramics is it's a medium that needs to be touched and handled, and you have to actually occupy the same space as it. Mm-hmm. So having the chance to work with a ceramicist, Maggie Boyd, was really amazing. I enjoyed every minute of it. So artists do a lot of borrowing. And, you know, I confess to doing that. I think that in terms of what I searched for as far as inspiration goes, it was a combination of looking at the actual images from the ceramic plates and bowls that are in the store that May shared with me, and going back and trying to think about how to create a vision of community that is also culturally accurate. And I think that as a public artist, who very often is asked to depict, literally depict histories of different spaces, one of the challenges is, how do you depict race? How do you depict gender? How do you create a narrative about people that it doesn't focus on excluding, you know, other people? How do you make it as accessible and relatable as possible? And you know, I think we talked a little bit about art and versus non-art, you know, and a lot of that rests on access. You know, how accessible is this image to read or relate to? And very often, you know, and I think that art with a capital A, you know, doesn't really look too kindly at art that is extremely, you know, narrative and illustrative. But, you know, I wanted to sort of forget about that. You know, I think what I liked about some of the images that I had researched, and I was thinking of one lovely advertisement that I saw in a book about Chinese design of people parading with these kites. It was at, it was all very ambiguous, you know, I mean, people in gowns, people celebrating in costumes, you know, I felt like, you know, maybe it opened up the possibility of not thinking about gender and race and color, and just think about perhaps the more playful interaction between them. But I do like the idea of a parade. I've loved parades all my life, so I think this idea of a procession that really was a kind of endless circle set against these waves, which were intended to represent a movement, just the movement of, and a wave of people moving in the same direction is something that I was just trying to play with.
Yeah, so just this past Sunday, we unveiled Tomie's vessels, and we were really interested in really embodying the figures that she had depicted on these vessels, and then bringing this parade or manifesting this parade into real life and walking around the heart of Chinatown and holding these kites as symbols of resilience, protection, regeneration. I feel like I'm still sitting with it. I think that walking around the heart of Chinatown, the parts of the neighborhood that I've walked around my whole life, was really meaningful, and also holding this banner that we had made too. We had Tomie's motifs and kites made out of wood, and Singha had painted them, and it was beautiful, but we really wanted there to be a grounding message that could tie everything together. And we recently finished a mural project with a queer Asian artist, Jess X Snow, which has a really clear message on it. It says, "In the future, our Asian community is safe." And just like Tomie was saying about this political moment, coming out of the pandemic, thinking about what it means to be Asian American, what it means to be an Asian American femme, queer, trans person, post-Atlanta, I think, yeah, there's a lot there. And I think that this celebration, this parade, was very healing in that way, to kind of come out of all of what we were working through with the grief and loss of, all of those folks that we lost during the Atlanta killings. And I don't have a good answer, but yeah, that was what the program was. And our banner said, "In the future, our Asian, femme, queer, trans community is safe." And that felt like such a healing way to really manifest that into reality and embody that into the W.O.W Project's next 5-10 years of work that we'll be doing in the neighborhood. Mm.
I think that parades as a form of protest are really a way of sharing what we aspire to in a public way. You know, it's a public display of affection and anger and all of these things that we care about. And certainly, you know, in the wake of all the Black Lives Matter protests, you know, we've seen how powerful it can be when people come out in some solidarity to lift up, you know, what our collective aspirations for this world are, whether it's an end to white supremacy, or whether it's our hopes and dreams for our communities. I feel like people are holding back less in terms of publicly sharing how they feel, and that's so important. Whether it's your vote, or you're coming out on a picket line, or writing, or making art, or you know, if not now, when, you know, are you going to come out and stand for something? And so you know, I do love the idea of a parade. I've always felt so. I think I think as a child, you know, I love the Thanksgiving parade. I just love you know, these displays, you know, of I think genuine affection and care for the event or the occasion. But one of the things that has always I've admired so much about W.O.W and May and all the young people who she's worked with is their desire to bring in an intergenerational and an older perspective into the space. May's parents and family are always present in the store and are so much a part of shaping the store's narrative and you know, just the way that they engage with everyone who walks into the space. You know, I feel like there is this this sense that this is a family of people of many ages who all have this shared, I think, commitment, you know, to sustaining this space. And I feel like every time I speak to someone from W.O.W, and really, you know, ever since I began working in Chinatown, and I don't want to say or imply that Chinatown is unique, or, you know, Chinese culture is unique in respecting older people, or feeling always that there is this need to transmit knowledge through generations. But, you know, I've always felt like my experience was welcomed, and you know, it's vice versa. I've learned so much from the young people that I've worked with. But it is important to connect to the histories that we have all experienced, to connect the dots, to make deepen our perspectives and our understanding of what needs to happen to bring people together by talking to all the people and listening to the people who have experienced it. Mm-hmm. So in terms of my own experience working in Chinatown, and also, you know, being, I think, unique in the sense that I was born and raised in New York. I grew up in post-war New York, where there were actually very few Japanese Americans, and Chinatown was still, as May said, a bachelor society. It was post-war New York in the 40s and 50s was a very different place. Chinatown, and many of my friends who grew up in Chinatown, my age, you know, always refer to it as the village. You know, it was like a small town. Everyone knew each other. I certainly knew all the Japanese American families that I grew up with in New York City. But I never really had a geographic community that was equivalent to many of the Asian communities on the West Coast or in Hawaii. So I think I always sort of gravitated to Chinatown as a space where I could kind of locate myself or find some common experiences and sort of shared cultural experiences as well. So my husband is Chinese, but you know, I met him in Chinatown actually 50 years ago. But I've always felt like searching for community has been a large part of my work, and so being situated in a neighborhood that I care so deeply about has been so important to me. So circling back so many years, after so many years of working in that community, and having this opportunity to reinvest my time and my work in Chinatown has really been an extraordinary experience.
Yeah, I think just building off of what Tomie was talking about before, about how the shop operates and how this is kind of like the grounding space for the W.O.W project's work and the groundswell of where it was born and bred and incubated. I think it comes from a lot of my own personal experience growing up in the shop, surrounded by my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my parents, my cousins all the time. And then also having that kind of trickle into how I operate the shop space. And as a family, I think all of us have a different role. We're all learning from each other on a daily basis, and that's kind of the framework that I carry over to the WOW Project's work, and making sure that we're listening and honoring everybody who came before us in this work, and making sure that youth, yes, definitely are at the center of the WOW Project's art and activism work, but we're also looking to build intergenerational bridges of understanding to take us into the future. So we're acknowledging that, but we're also building on that history and that legacy, like Tomie was saying, with our own flavor and our own take of what resonates to us right now in this moment. And I feel like this collaboration speaks to that directly of, how do we bring in somebody who holds so much history with the community, the neighborhood, and also have that propel us into the future, help us imagine that future, help us radically parade around the neighborhood and hold all of those feelings, like Tomie was saying, fiery energy, rage, grief, but also end by also holding like tenderness and care and community care for ourselves and each other, I think was really important to this collaboration as well.
So I'm a public artist, and I guess I self-identify myself that way because I've intentionally always tried to find spaces to work in or to create work with communities that are not places where you would normally find art. I really enjoy working and collaborating with all kinds of people and in all kinds of neighborhoods. And I think the work that I make always strives to reflect that, this collective voice. And, you know, sometimes the art gets lost in that process. You know, it's really, for me, more about the engagement with people in the conceptualizing and discussing and making of the work. And, you know, I think in terms of this project, it felt in many ways like a distillation or a culmination of all the kinds of projects that I've enjoyed working with, because it involved you know, something that was so uniquely site-specific. It involved so many really beautiful ideas about community and how art could uplift and amplify those feelings and ideas. And you know, it really involved establishing or developing personal relationships to people that I think have, in so many surprising ways, you know, brought the project to life. And I guess, you know, the parade is this wonderful manifestation of how a project like this can actually be brought to life by so many different people, and in such a, you know, really a wonderful, creative way. It was totally unexpected, you know, that the procession around the vows would actually inspire an actual parade through Chinatown. But you know, on a more reflective level, I think that it, in terms of my overall art practice, I think that I've always found myself struggling with ideas about art, and more specifically, you know, who do we make art for? How do we make art in community with other people? And you know, where do we find meaning in the work. And without that meaning, why would you get up in the morning, and make an object? It has to exist in the world in some way. And I think culture is, of course, so much more than, a work of art or an object or a painting. It's language and food and traditions, and it involves these spaces that we live in that are embedded with our experiences and our memories that are slowly disappearing, across the city. And so it's so important to protect and preserve, I think, these parts of our culture that are actually so much a part of ourselves and our own identities. But it's also important, I think, to rethink what art can actually be. And I think this project has just been one of many really important, I guess, doors that have opened for me to be able to, in community, again, with other people, try to build something that we just talked a little bit about, well, it's what we do new, but, nothing is entirely new, of course, but, how can we bring something into the world that really aspires to be something new? So I'm, so pleased with having been, invited to be part of this collaboration. It's meant so much to me.
I am the 5th generation owner of W.O.W, which is the oldest operating store on Mott Street in Chinatown. And I'm also the founder and director of the W.O.W project, which is a place-based initiative that puts Asian, femme, queer, trans youth at the helm of resisting the cultural displacement here in Chinatown and using arts and activism to do that. Those early years of working in the neighborhood and being involved in your collaborations as a part of the collective at Basement Workshop, how has that informed your practice and shaped and grown your practice over the years? And if there are any ways in which working with the Chinatown Art Brigade or founding it, if any of those pieces of those times, those memories, those moments where you felt like they were really meaningful collaborations, have any of those aspects kind of shown up in your work now, whether that be in your individual practice or the Chinatown Art Brigade or elsewhere?
I just want to say that I really appreciated your inviting me to speak at the mural unveiling, because I was just very touched by how receptive the younger muralists were to my being there, and also this acknowledgement that there was a kind of through line between the history of these, the first Asian American cultural spaces like Basement Workshop and the early murals that were painted in Chinatown in the 1970s, and what people are doing today, and how eager people are to really learn more about the histories of these projects. And I think it's pretty much, it's pretty evident and not surprising that so many of the same kinds of issues and questions are still so important to address today. Just the inequities and economic disparities that exist, and the ways in which Chinatown has this enormous resilience and cultural pride, in the businesses and the working people who live here, which were all celebrated in different ways in the murals that were painted in those days. one of the things that I think I drew from my experiences working with Basement was the power of working collectively and collaboratively, and how we each contributed something to a greater whole, and how that was actually a really joyous and experience that in many ways pushed back against so many of our notions about what art and culture is and how it's made, and what we learned in school, and how we envisioned making art in the future and in the world. I mean, so many of the young artists who stepped through the doors of Basement in the 1970s went on to become professional writers and artists and poets, and the leaders of social service organizations and professors. And so Basement was, in many ways, this a laboratory and a platform for so many young people who were trying to figure out what to do with their lives. And I see a lot of that happening at WOW, and I see the ways in which these interactions between people who are in their 20s and people my age, and people who work on so many of the wonderful projects that you organize, are building these, I think, building and preparing themselves for the way that they will be in the world. And it's very reminiscent of Basement and those early days when I was their age. But I also feel like we're witnessing something very different in the kind of space that you're building here, and the partnerships that you're trying to create with artists and youth and other businesses and cultural institutions. I feel like it's a very powerful thing that you're doing, and just really grateful to be part of it.
The question was about you, though. It was about how this history has shown up in your own practice and Chinatown Art Brigade or elsewhere. Like, what are some of those learnings or takeaways that have almost like blossomed in
I almost
this current
can't talk
moment?
about my work without talking about the people that I collaborate with, because it draws, I feel like the work draws so much strength, from my relationships or my the ways in which I learn about the spaces in which I make the work. And we talked about your family grounding the store. I feel like these relationships that I hope to build with community organizations or with other artists or people who are interested and curious and want to be engaged in what I do are so important to my own understanding of how to make the work, that I can't talk about my work without talking about how important these different sources of inspiration are. And even at my age, I feel like it's a process of listening and learning and somehow responding in a unique way to every situation. So even though I may have at one point seen myself as a printmaker or a muralist or an installation maker, or in fact I once got a grant from the Joan Mitchell Foundation for sculpture, and I never really saw myself in that role. I felt like it was okay, to be as open as I could possibly be, and not claim to be one thing or another. It's made for some very interesting collaborations. I know that I was actually very inspired, I have to say, by the words of Mariam Kaba, who talked a lot about not needing to be in front of every issue, and sort of stepping back and letting other voices come forward. And I feel that way a lot about my work, that it allows me to do that, but I also see the value in that, that there are other voices that are so much stronger and more beautiful and more resonant, and I can give them the space to be that through my work.
Mm.
Basement Workshop was an Asian American cultural center that was situated in Chinatown for almost 16 years, and it was, there were so many people that passed through Basement, but one of the most, I guess, influential people was probably Fei Chang, who was the executive director of Basement for most of its existence. And it was many things. I mean, it wasn't just a cultural center, but it was an archive of Chinatown history that later gave birth to the Museum of Chinese in America. There were people at Basement who developed curriculums for and fought very hard for Asian American studies and around the city, and it was the home of Bridge magazine, which is a biannual publication that actually kept on printing for about 10 years. And it was, I think, a laboratory, and it was a mecca for a lot of aspiring young Asian American poets and writers and musicians and artists who really wanted to claim, their Asian American identity and help build an Asian American culture, because that, even though now, it's very debatable that whether there is such a field, I think a lot of people were really invested in claiming something for themselves through their work and their art and their music and their writing. I did want to talk about the activism, but what did you see as the future for a while?
Yeah, it's a good question, Tomie.
Do you have any? I mean, it's okay if you don't know right now.
Yeah, I think right now what I'm thinking a lot about is the longevity of the work and how to sustain it, and thinking about the work beyond myself and how we can bring in more young people to take over the leadership position and steward this into the next generation. I feel like it's taking up a lot of my headspace right now and thinking about the future for a while, but I have, just in terms of like place and space, I'm thinking a lot about how we can expand the studio space further into this basement area, how it can be like more set up with the tools and the can be really like the grounding for this work. Like, this is a great space now, but I think just more concretely, how can we expand what this is? I don't know, hearing you talk a lot about Basement, I think felt really, I could see a lot of wow in that, and what it means and what it is for a lot of young people, and finding who they are, figuring out what it means to be Asian American. Yeah, that's my non-answer. But yeah, thinking a lot about longevity and how to make sure that we can sustain this over time. And for me, like, that's relationship to this building and the store, and like even in our 6-story walk-up ecosystem, like how does this all work together to make sure that this building can be here for long term? Because I do wear a lot of different hats with, like, helping my family manage the residential part of this building, helping manage the business and the sourcing and the products, and also doing the W.O.W project work, and being able to see the link between all of those different community stakeholders, right, who might not normally speak to each other or see each other from a certain perspective of landlord-tenant relationship, or small business owner and customer, or artist and collaborator. So I think that's like my superpower. I can wear all those hats at the same time and really look through this lens and be able to see where those connections can be made. And I really want to have this be a model for future spaces in New York City and beyond.
I wonder what my superpower is.
Yeah, so thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, thriving and surviving is so important. And I feel like in this post-COVID moment, every artist is probably wondering what there is to go back to, because so much has changed. Whether you're in the theater or you're a musician or an exhibiting artist, I think the choices that are left now that COVID and the pandemic have devastated so much of our economy, our challenges, and I feel like I'm so ready not to go back to the way the art world functioned before. There's so much to be said about not trying to change the institutions that didn't serve us, and just trying to instead to create the alternatives that we want. And you had mentioned earlier something about alternative spaces, which was a really big thing in the 70s, because we had the real estate in New York to be able to create bricks and mortar spaces, those workspaces that are so important to artists in order to survive and thrive aren't here anymore. So I think that trying to come together and think about what are the possibilities there are to create a really a culture that is reflective of all the people that live here in the city, that feels like the next thing that all of us should be involved in.
Yeah.